friends. Welcome to this second session of Divine Creativity and Holy Imagination with Liz Ullery Swenson. I introduced her last course session, and you all have been here, so I don't want to introduce her again, but just saying, with her theater degree and her theology degree and working that all together, I mean, this has been really cool, and I'm looking forward to this second part of her course that's going to be more hands-on and more experiential, as opposed to the first one, which was really helping us understand some of the theory and concepts and helping her pull us into that. So, Liz, did I give you enough time?
Almost, yeah. I'm going to message you and then I'll just wing it.
Well, I could just say the whole thing all over again.
No, it's okay. Okay, so how do I switch to, okay. Enton walked me through this back when we did like a trial run, and I can't, clearly doing it in real time and in trial are a little bit different. So as Enton said, I'm Liz Ullery Swenson. I'm out here on the West Coast. It is about 5:30, and I recognize that it is much later for some of you. So hang in there with me. Thank you for spending your evening with me. I begin each gathering with Wildwood with the words, together. I have to adjust the beginning because we're not Wildwood. This is a community of faith where we are invited to show up exactly as we are and exactly as we are becoming, whole and holy. And I invite you to show up in this space the same. You show up as your whole selves and your holy selves, bringing whatever you bring with you, your past experience, your current struggles, your joys. Whatever you bring and have experienced in your day is with you this evening. I invite you to take a deep breath. See if you can arrive fully in the place where you are with whatever you have. I will jump right in because I want to make sure that we have a good amount of time to kind of have some conversation too. So I like my titles, right? And maybe that's part of my own creativity, is that I try to make what I do funny or humorous and interesting in that way too. So this invitation to read the room is talking about the spaces and the places where we gather. I'm trying to find my notes. Our theology and our practice teaches us that all spaces are sacred and holy. But the question then is, how do they meet the needs of the creative activity that we're doing? And I think this is a question that a lot, if not all, churches are asking these days about how the spaces that we have are utilized and meeting the needs of our communities now. I mean, they were designed for 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, right? The churches that were at the time, the congregations during those times aren't the same as they are now. And so wherever your community and congregation is in figuring out how to live in your building, what that looks like, and what your community needs to live in your building, is an awesome time to also begin to think about how you might create a space that is that leans into creativity and allows for that to become more naturally or be easier in a sense. Wildwood, I don't know if you know a whole lot about Wildwood. It started in 2016 to create space, creative space for those for whom church has been a challenging or an environment that wasn't reflective of their own spiritual journey. So it's, the intent is to do church differently. And so I come from a very different context into this, but I grew up in traditional churches. My dad was a pastor for 20 odd years. And I feel like I have this both and piece where I know traditional churches and the gifts and the wonder and the special thing, the specialness of that kind of community. But I also am really loving creating new ways of doing community and having a lot of fun playing with it in that way. So one of the things that I was really intentional about when we started Wildwood is I did not want to own a building. And you can ask me later, but that has certainly changed now because, in a sense, Wildwood has been in 7 different locations over the last 8 years. And that doesn't include Zoom. For those years we were on Zoom only. And it doesn't include the times where we were meeting outside or in a park. There was a time period where we didn't have a space. And so we just met in a park for a couple months. And with each space, I've learned a little bit more about what we need as a community, but also how we live into a space in a way that allows us to be who we are. And so one of the biggest challenges then has been figuring out what space we need, what space we have access to, and recognizing that each time we move, our community changes. Partly because we're moving because our needs change often, but also because location, space, aesthetics, feel, all of those things can change when you move locations, and that connects with a different community of folks. So in a sense, I sort of jokingly, but also very genuinely say that we've started Wildwood 7 times over, 8 if you count Wildwood or online Zoom, because each time we move, what we do changes enough that it feels like we're starting over in a lot of ways. So in a sense, I'm very jealous of you all because you probably have a more grounded place to come from and bring this into a space and reimagine what's already there instead of trying to create it every time we have to try and move again. But over those same 8 years and 7 spaces, we've really clarified what it is that we need and what's important to us. So we started in, oops, that's not what I want to move. There we go. We started in my living room in 2016, and this is our very first gathering. And we gathered around our dinner table and we did finger painting as a reflection of, I think the questions were, what does sacred space look like? What does God feel like? Just sort of this opportunity to finger paint is very tactile, and nobody is an excellent or excelled finger painter. It is a sort of a natural or a very nice even playing field for people to come into, and there's no, it's less threatening, I think, than in a lot of other kinds of art because nobody's really good at it. That it's inherently messy and it's inherently tactile in that way. Everybody will leave with finger paint under their fingernails. And I think it was a perfect beginning for us because we really got to embrace what messy church was. We got to embrace what it looked like to do it differently. We sort of in a couple of months outgrew our living room, and the next space we moved into was this bookstore that's downtown in our Olympia. And I still love it. It's one of my favorite places because it had this amazing aesthetic. And there was this big, you can't really see it in any of these pictures, but there's this giant what's it called? Skylight, a giant skylight above us. And so when it rained, which it often did when we were gathering, it actually sounded like a church when you have those pitched roof and the rain is on that sort of, it sounded very familiar. So here's these elements of traditional church that for many of us have a sort of sense memory piece that I was able to then find in these other spaces. So it was cozy. It had this beautiful custom made long wooden table. It was a beast to move if we ever had to, but it is probably one of the most beautiful pieces of furniture I've ever seen. And it allowed us to settle into a space and begin to build community in a more, it allowed us to build community in a different way. There were limitations with it. The bookstore is, this space is above the bookstore, so it's on a second story. And at the time it was sort of sketchy, narrow, uneven stairs. And the bookstore owner, my friend Andrea, has since done this like extensive renovation and it's beautiful and I love it even more, but it's still on the second story. So there was this sort of physical limitation of of accessibility, but we outgrew the space pretty quickly too. And so we got to move on up, and this really was the space where I feel like Wildwood could be its most wild self. This was an art gallery downtown, and actually the owner, I think, went to McPherson, like has some Church of the Brethren connection, or like maybe her husband did BVS. I don't quite remember, but I walked in and there was this sense of connection already. And I find that the spaces where Wildwood has found our greatest belonging, there is already some sort of sense of connection, whether it's, God's movement and magic in how we move in the world, or just sort of happenstance. But we felt a lot of belonging in this space while I was on maternity leave. Let me back up for a second. One of the things that we got to do, this space was very adaptive. We could do a lot of things here. There was always art on the walls, and that always felt like it was inspiring our creativity, giving us the sense of holy creativity. And it took the coziness of the bookstore and amplified it with this extra level of creative inspiration. And it had concrete floors, so finally we weren't worried about making a mess, because it just added to the splatter art gallery vibe. But while I was on maternity leave with my daughter, the owner of the art gallery changed how she used the space, and we very quickly were moved into part of the art gallery that was much more stores. There was little things for sale and very fiddly bits, and very quickly became reality that we were not going to be able to stay there. And that was probably one of the hardest moves. Second hardest move was a big one, because we did find that sense of belonging, and it did feel like it reflected us really well. But from that, we were able to carry forward this valuing of art in our space. And again, that sort of bright lightness, a cozy space, and aesthetically beautiful, sort of reflecting the beauty of divine creativity. And I think, so then we then had to very quickly find another space. We also spent a couple weeks outdoors while we were trying to find it, and we moved into a yoga studio. It was fine. It was fiddly. We couldn't wear shoes, so holy ground and all that, but it still was awkward. And we couldn't get messy because we couldn't ruin the floors. Occasionally we'd put down like this giant drop cloth, but it was a lot of work to be able to make it what we wanted. And so in that space, we learned what we didn't want. From there, we got to, in the spring of 2019, move into what we call the Little Church. It was the smaller, I think it was Baptist church building that was on the property of this large Lutheran church. And the building was nearly perfect for us. And in that space, we had a lot of autonomy and ownership. The space wasn't shared by very many people. And so within a couple of months, we were able to sort of leave our mark on the space in a way that it felt like ours. Whereas other spaces, we had to pick up and put everything away and leave every week. Here, we could leave the chairs in a space in the arrangement that we needed. We could leave up some of our lights or lamps or different things. And that then sort of allowed us to feel this sort of groundedness. Another piece of that space that was really wonderful is that there was an outdoor community garden space. So we got to lean into this whole other kind of messy creativity with doing some, which I'll talk about more, some liturgical gardening, and how we got to sort of literally put down roots, not just in the space, but in the ground. And I think as a community, but especially for myself, we could see ourselves being there for a long time. And I had even begun to put a proposal together to ask the Lutheran congregation if we could take over the building building and create an art creativity centered community space. We had an architectural firm, I had a nonprofit board, like we were in this, and the congregation went in a different direction without much communication. So we went into this season of excitement. We had this idea, we were moving forward with it. And not only did we get shut down on the idea, we were also told we needed to move, and within a couple of weeks. So that was really, again, it's really heartbreaking to have to leave a space, not because you need to outgrow it or you need to move on, but because our sense of belonging or our sense of place there isn't welcomed anymore or isn't feasible anymore. And it was really, it was not only really hard for me, it was really hard for everyone because it had become our space. It was where we gathered, or it was the place where we were when the pandemic started. It was the place that we had our last in-person gathering, where we did our wild dinner and communion together. And it was the place that we got to come back together for the first time after we were able to safely gather. And we spent time out in the garden in between, but it was this home, it was this place. And so to have to make that shift was really hard for the community. And one of the things that really solidified for me what it looks like to belong and the value of having space. And I share this picture because this is one of our kiddos on the day that we were doing our move out, our last little stuff. She hugged the post in the middle of the room goodbye. And it's near where my house is. And my daughter, every time we drive by, says, "Can we go back to the little church now?" So for these kiddos, this was the space where they learned church, where they learned faith community. And it became a space that was theirs. And it's a sentiment that I think a lot of us know. We have those formative church years of what it means to belong to a space. I know many stories of folks of all ages and generations that are deeply tied to a physical building. And I think that's deeply important as we try and do these new ways of gathering in these spaces. And I think that's partly why I shared all of the sort of the theory and the theology behind integrating creativity, because it is a place to begin to help tell the story and help invite others into how we can create creative space in our pre-existing sacred spaces. It can help create the environment and the culture and the ethos within the congregation where it's an actual part of an identity and not just some activities that we do, that it can be part of who the congregation and who the community can be. So when we were sort of quickly moved out of our little church space, we were then offered space in the big church. And we really struggled in that space logistically and spiritually. We had to take down and set up 10 tables and chairs every week. It had fluorescent lights. It didn't reflect who we were. And we were, again, having to pack in and pack out all of our things that were part of our community. And after having been in a space where we had belonging, it was really hard to go back. And I think not only did I feel that sense of disconnect, but the community, our whole congregation did as well. And it sort of was like this dead end. It just sort of felt stagnant in this way. And it didn't have the sort of aesthetic vibe, energy, and spirit that we found was really central to who we are. In the big church, though, we did get to use, there was a kitchen space that we got to use a couple of times. And then we did a couple of events like Easter and Christmas Eve and stuff in the big sanctuary. And it's a beautiful space. But again, I remember being in that space and just sort of like, I had a hard time preaching because I felt stuck. I couldn't lead because it just felt like it wasn't where we were supposed to be. And so this last November, we had the opportunity to move into our current space. And it's a space that I hope will be our last move for a little while. And as soon as we walked in, we were greeted by the sign. It says, "Welcome Wildwood Gathering. We're so glad you're here." And the energy shifted for us in a huge way. And just something about the space where we are, the space where we're held, allows us to feel safe to do creative things, to have vulnerable conversations, to bring our whole selves. And I think that's really important when we're talking about how we invite a creative spirit in. We need to feel safe. It's interesting, at least, so this church is a Presbyterian and Lutheran church that I worked in about 10 years ago. And it's the church where I was working when I left to do Wildwood. So there's this sense of like full circle-ness for me and for the community as well. And I'm then friends with the pastor. And so our moving into the space was intentional, and it comes out of a desire for collaboration and doing shared ministry and finding ways not only to be collaborative in our faith communities, but be collaborative in the building. So we're talking about, how can we bring art into the space that reflects Wildwood? How can we have, they're doing this big capital campaign for building renovation, and she's asked us to be part of deciding how the space looks. And that to me, it's just like, it's a totally different way of thinking about being in space and how we share space together. And when, for your congregations, if there's an opportunity to do a major renovation, to be really intentional about the aesthetics and what it feels like to be in the space, and how the space can support this idea of a creative, artistic spirit and community and God in the world, in the congregation. Let's see. Like I said, in this space, you can't really see in the picture, but it's a larger space. We're in the chapel. There is a main sanctuary as well that we can use on occasion, but it's got its openness, it's got brightness. It's a very flexible space. We can move things around easily. We're not worried about getting messy. There's a kitchen, it's accessible. There's lots of all of those pieces that it checks off. And so it feels really good to be in a space that we can actually collaboratively find belonging. And that sort of, it speaks to this idea that it's not just to be, it's not just activities, and that's a place to begin, right? Integrating specific activities that invite creativity to your community is a really great place to begin and to play with it. And then if you have the opportunity to move into the logistics and the atmosphere and how the space can ignite inspiration, spur creativity and imagination, or not, right? So you can get a sense of what you need and what you want based on where you are. And, there's like, is it okay to get paint on the floor? We're going to get paint and Play-Doh in the carpet. It's going to be a much, that may not meet the needs of where you are. And I think I offer this because space matters. And I often think that perhaps our simplistic brotheranness or Anabaptistness forgets that space and place and artistry matter in how we engage with the space, how we connect with the space, and what can happen in the space. And I think it's hard when our buildings aren't necessarily meeting the needs of where we are. And it's hard when the community can't fill or support financially the building. And so this is sort of like a struggle. And I hope that maybe creativity can invite you to see your spaces in a different way. So I'm going to take we go until it's an hour and a half. Okay. Keeping track of time. I'm curious what your spaces look like currently. I'm going to stop sharing for a second. Oops. Okay, there you all are. Hello. What do some of your spaces look like? Are they already conducive to getting messy and creative, or do you have some ideas of how you might be able to?
Well, I guess I've been nominated to share what our space is like. And it's a space that we actually built. We were given the land and we all worked together. A lot of the people, some of them have passed already, but we do really have such a tie to the building. It was created to be very flexible because our previous church was not. It was created to be very live because our previous church was not. And it was like the typical, the center aisle, pews face forward on either side, and the choir was right up front where everybody stared at you. Nobody liked that as the choir. So, and everywhere you went, there were steps. And we wanted to be, more welcoming to all ages. And so we made sure it was on one level, totally accessible. So we have pews that are padded and comfortable, but they are movable, and we move them regularly. Sometimes we brought tables in and use them. Now we do have carpeting. It's it's a kind of a darker carpeting that doesn't show a lot of dirt. But we have eaten around the table. We have done some creativity around table, and some even love feast, communion, that kind of thing. I have a baptistry. But we brought some stained glass windows from the other church, just a couple that were beautiful, and created a couple new round ones. And so there's part of the old and new, but we think we got the best of that move, that change. So what else anybody want to say about it?
Well, the only thing is now we're now our church is kind of too big for us almost, because our congregation is aging and coming down in size, and the church is about 25, 30 years old. And
this building.
Yeah, so we have some maintenance issues, but other than
So
that,
the new building is 25 years old, or
it's actually older.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is the new building that you.
The new building. So we're starting to show our age. But yeah, but it's a very flexible space.
And we do stream online. We have hybrid worship. We do have some families, some young families, but the majority is older people, which is that's good. But I guess we aren't as creative as we could be.
Like older folks can finger paint too. And that's sort of what I hope to inspire, is to sort of take away some of those barriers to
We do.
feeling like it's hard. Other folks who, yeah, Debbie.
There we go. Well, I've been in a variety of spaces because I do interim ministry. And one of the things I do when I come into a new ministry is I think about not only the space, but what the space prescribes in terms of worship. That and particularly I think about this with regard to screens, how we use screens. Okay, so there are churches that are really involved with, really engaged in, shall we say, using PowerPoint. Okay, and I guess there's a part of me that feels like that can be helpful, but we have to really think about how we use that. Like if we put the scripture up on the screen, for instance, that's very different than if we say to people, you have pew Bibles, engage the scripture in the Pew Bible. Look, it's about, do they look up? Do they look down? With some older adults, if you don't have a white background with dark print, or dark background with white print, if it isn't clear, if there's some picture in the background, it's hard for them to read. They get frustrated, I think that screens and kind of electronic and visual, multimedia images should support what you're doing, but it shouldn't become like a lecture. It shouldn't be teacherly, and we have to think about, the congregation we have and what worship means to us and how the space and impacts that. Also, people talk about the space being the wrong size for people. It's uncomfortable if it's too crowded. It's uncomfortable if it's too big. And so how do you take a larger space and create within it a smaller space? How do you move down onto the floor from a chancel that puts the preacher so far away? How do you bring people together? How do you engage people with one another in the pews? I mean, almost every congregation I've been in, at some point I'll say to them, okay, today we're going to get up and move around the congregation. I'm going to ask you to go find people to talk to who you've never sat with in the whole time you've been here.
Yeah.
It makes them very nervous and a little anxious, but it's really helpful. It's really good to have them move around this space.
The
So
spaces become static based on how long they've been in the space, how they've used the space in the past. And it can be really, and that's where this idea of creativity can help, shift. We're not just moving pews because we have to move pews. We're moving pews to make space for this big table so we can do art together. And I think it can be this little nudge, an invitation that can be a challenge in some spaces. You also bring up a good point around, if you're doing a blended gathering, how do you incorporate art and creativity in that? And so I'll make sure, as we're going through some of the things that I have done with Wildwood, how you can invite those who aren't in the space to engage too, which is a nice little segue into a reminder that in the email that you received this afternoon, there is a link to a PDF, which is a coloring page that if you'd like to download that and color it on an iPad or print it out and doodle. One of the things that's really valuable in Wildwood is that we have space to doodle and write and draw in the middle of our gatherings. And so that's something that, if you're doing finger painting in the room, you probably can't send finger paint, though I have done it. You can't send finger paint to everybody who's at home, but you can offer them, grab a pencil and a notebook, or grab a couple of crayons and sit down. And there's other ways to bring the essence of the creativity into a home environment. So you all, I hope, have brought your crayons and notebook and can sort of engage in this creative listening, creative doodling throughout the rest of our evening. Are there other, another minute to...
Oh yeah. Well, I just one other thing I just wanted to say. I thank you so much for bringing up the space, because what you're trying to do is get people to participate and engage in the space, not use it passively.
Yep. Yeah. It should be a living space. Yeah. Okay. Anybody else have a quick comment or reflection on their own spaces?
This is Carolyn Schrock from the McPherson Church. After COVID, and we were beginning to meet again in the building, we were discussing what we would do for children, and should we have a separate space? Our sanctuary is very old and typical, pews and a chancel area. Anyway, in discussion with the parents, they said we want our children in the service. So they suggested that we take some pews out. So we chose to take 3 areas in the church and take a pew out so that families can sit in the pew and have a wider space before the next pew. and long enough for a couple families to sit in that pew. We put down a hunk of carpet, and we have boxes of activities, games. We haven't gotten to finger paint yet, but games and tablets and drawing and things that the kids participate, they do on their own. And the interesting thing is that there's one family that's got a cute little redheaded 3-year-old that their area that they choose to sit in is sort of toward the front. And this little 3-year-old loves the music, and she gets up and she dances whenever there's music, and everybody just loves that. But she's got the space to do that, and she gets out into the aisle sometimes too. But anyway, we provided a creative space for the children.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important energy to make space for, right? That when we create space for creativity for the whole congregation, we're also creating space for kiddos to be engaged in ways that are not necessarily trying to get kids to conform to how adults do it, but allowing adults to sort of begin to conform or adopt and adapt some of what the kids do. Okay, I'm gonna keep us going. We'll have another opportunity to do some chatting in a little bit. Let's see if I can remember how to. I haven't really used Zoom since we went back sort of mostly in person. And there's been a lot of changes. I also finished seminary. We used a lot of Zoom in seminary, and these things were not there yet.
And Liz, it'll come back up to the first slide, so you'll have to be prepared to scoot forward.
Okay.
It's a great review of what you just were sharing with us. So I'm enjoying seeing them all again.
Okay. Maybe take a moment to move your arms, wiggle your bodies. One of the things that I did a couple of years ago, I was preaching with a mainline Methodist church, and I had done one of my seminary internships there. And I was preaching on the text about the woman who was hunched over and talking about bodies and how our bodies are in relation to spirituality, you know, all this kind of stuff. And I asked folks in their pew to do some chair yoga with me. And so we, you know, arms up and we breathe. And I could see some of the folks being really uncomfortable. And then there were also other folks who just, they had not had an opportunity in a sacred spiritual space to have that way of connecting with their bodies. And it was really cool. So that's another way to bring creativity in, is not just art, you know, hard art. It can also be movement, you know, like with the kids and the signals, the signs for songs, right? There's ways that we can invite movement as a creative outlet. So take some movement, wiggle around. All that we do within Creative Church should be experiential, collaborative, experimentation, co-created, immersive, and holistic. And I think, or I hope, that all of these elements are, in some sense, a natural reflection of how we do worship already. That perhaps we're just expanding how we do it, but that there's space in here where these elements are already present. And so you can find ways to expand on them. And I really wanted to have like a nice sort of like way of sort of going through all of this and dividing it with headings and stuff. And it wasn't working. So we're just kind of go through. I'm going to highlight some of the things that Wildwood has done that have worked pretty well, particularly well for us. This is just a small sampling of things that we've done. As I was going through photos for the last 8 years, I was like, oh, wow, we did that. Oh, that was such a cool thing. Because I'd forgotten some of the stuff that we had done. And now that we're 8 years on, I can I can, reuse some of it, borrow it from myself. So one of the things that's become really iconic for Wildwood is that we've used brown packing paper along our tables. Not every week, but pretty regularly. Sometimes it's contemplative, sometimes it's just doodling, but it's been a way of sort of setting the table, setting the space in this intentional way of, what does the table look like? Are we using long tables or are we using round tables? How is our community connecting around the space? When we talk about doing art, you're going to need some sort of flat surface. So we may have to figure out how a table can fit into the worship space. And that may mean taking some pews out temporarily or permanently. Temporarily that becomes permanent, to be able to make space for that. And maybe you have to move to another space, right? Like the church where Wildwood meets has their big, proper, grand sanctuary, and they have a chapel space. And that's where Wildwood meets. And they have other worship services in that space too, because they can put tables up and have more flexibility. We use it for everything. It becomes our altar and our centerpiece. We put candles on it. We have meals on it. It's a tablecloth. We can just, roll it up and put it in the compost. We use doodling. We do prayers. And it has sort of become this aesthetic of our community too, that there's this, it's a little bit rough, not quite perfect, and sort of sets the tone for what space we're walking into. Another way, because Wildwood has moved locations so often, and we've never had a space that was, except for the little church, right? We've never had a space that really felt like we could leave an imprint in there. We make prayer flags every year, and we string the prayer flags every Sunday in the space that we're gathering. And we're working from the idea or respectfully borrowing from the Tibetan culture of creating prayer flags and allowing the sacred spiritual prayers to shower us and to hold the space with us. And so again, it's a creative outlet. We invite, everybody makes their own flags. We sew them together. We have, there's like incredible artists, there's kid scribbles, there's just everything. And it's different every year because we make them anew every year and we add to them. And it's a reflection of the community. And again, it's that visual marker of we're coming into this space and this is sacred space. And that can be, we also have a candle that we light every week. Something to the effect of we light this candle as a visible symbol of the holy dancing in our presence, reflected and dancing each one of us, connecting us to each other and all people near and far. May we be specially attuned to the nearness of that spirit in all that we say and do. And some version, slightly adapted, of those words are said every week as our gathering. So we have sort of brown paper that sets the stage, not every week, but often. We have flags that are a visual way of naming it a sacred space wherever we are, outside, quirky yoga studio. We even, there have been times where I've brought Wildwood to a congregation, sort of like, here's a taste of Wildwood, and I bring the flags because this is how we create the space of Wildwood. And from there, everything's on the table. Like I said, we do finger painting. We'll use Play-Doh for prayers. There's something, it's all about getting out of, in sort of the same way that I invited us to move a little bit. It's about getting out of our heads and getting into our bodies and into our hearts and centering into a way of finding belonging in a tactile, tangible way. So we use, we'll do Play-Doh for prayers. and I'll even throw it on the table sometimes when we're not doing a specific Play-Doh thing, because it's nice to play with and move and hold while you're listening. And when you have your hands moving, oftentimes your brain has a different ability to listen and to hear things in a different way. It sort of does that right brain, left brain connections that sometimes get lost. My spouse drew the illustration with joy, and we had a whole series. I'll show some more of it later on, but we did this whole series over Advent, and each week we added another panel that reflected the theme of Advent. And so it was a collective coloring project. Had a big table out, crayons, colored pencils in this case were available, and everyone was invited to spend a few minutes anytime in the gathering, anytime on our Sunday gathering, to just color. Some folks spent the whole time there. Others came and did a little bit and left, but it was just this way of creating visual prayer and meditation together. And then finger paint is just fun. Like I said, it's this leveling way of, no one's particularly gifted at finger paint. It's always going to be a little smudgy and messy. And that's the point. Our imperfect human selves creating imperfect art as imperfect prayers. And you can give it themes. You can do it in lots of different ways, but it's been, gosh, I don't think we've done it every year, but there's been some opportunity frequently to get messy in that way. We also do sidewalk chalk, prayers and blessings. It started in 2016. As you remember, it was a rather challenging year for all of us, and we needed some outlet to be able to create a sense of peaceful blessings in our neighborhood. And so we got sidewalk chalk and went out and just drew on the sidewalk. All kinds of things. You hear some examples. I like it's drink water, so it's the water line thing. They colored on the word water, and so it's just folks get really silly and creative. The kids are into it. Again, some people are super artistic. There's some incredible work that's done on the sidewalks, and some people are very silly and doodling. But it gets us outside. We usually do it. We started doing it. At the sort of end of summer, right before school begins, because when we were in the Good Shepherd, the Lutheran church space, the little church and the big church is across the street from our high school and an elementary school. And so we would tie it to the beginning of school. And so as kids walked up to their schools on the first day, they would see all this chalk art sort of leading them into their buildings. And I don't think it was, maybe one of the years in there, somehow we did it at the end of the school year. And we made it into the senior reflection end of year video for graduation. And the seniors got credit for it. But it was just really fun that there was this thing that we offered to the community that the students noticed that they appreciated. There was some funny little things they added, made a little inappropriate sometimes, but it was just this way of we got to engage with the community. We got to know why we did it. We had fun with it, and they got to take ownership and run with it. So we're not meeting near that school anymore. I don't know if we're going to do a field trip or if we'll just do it downtown. We're now across the street from the Capitol and Legislative Building. So that may bring some different ways of thinking about how we bring prayer and blessing on the sidewalks in our neighborhoods. And I think I mentioned briefly last week that this isn't necessarily accessible for everyone, right? You're not going to have the 96-year-old, ideally, probably, out doing sidewalk chalk. But could they come out and hold the bucket of chalk? Could they bring the snacks? We always do popsicles afterward. So while we're also bringing in creativity, how can we also be creative about how we invite people into it? And that's sort of the space question, again, the sort of age question, accessibility, physical ability, making sure that it's, even on Zoom, right? How do we make sure it's inclusive to the best of our abilities? These are those big community collective art pieces that we did. These are 3 of them. I don't think we got the first Sunday. So we, hope, peace, joy, love, right? And they tied to themes. Our theme that year was Holy Wisdom. And so we used the Holy Wisdom Sophia as a reflection of the divine in our world. And so we put that image of Holy Wisdom in different places in our world. Pregnant Mary, this was a year around the southern border, was a place of hot contention and needed prayer and presence. And so we used these illustrations to tell that story. We told a story around experiencing houselessness or home insecurity. And so each of these ways we told the narrative, we told the scripture, and we created the art around it. And the other one, the long one, we did a Beatitudes. Blessed are the, and we had all these blanks. And everyone came up and added their own blessed are the. And so when we were done, we had this beautiful list of all of these blessings that we were sharing out into the world, and all the people that we were naming as blessed, each other and beyond our space as well. One of the things that we do on a regular basis when the weather is nice is we do wildwood walks. Instead of meeting in our building, we will meet at a park, at a trail somewhere, and I will offer poem, blessing, something to start us off, and then everybody heads out. And maybe you end up walking with someone, maybe you're just chasing your kids, but we are getting out and encountering the holy in the natural world around us. Wildwood, the wildness of God and the holiness of the woods, we're getting out into the woods. And then, of course, joyful prayer, joyful play as prayer. We had a Sunday where we got up, this is giant Jenga, we had Legos, we had Play-Doh again, we had all these different ways of bringing adults into play spaces that we don't often do, right? How often do adults play giant? And it's like, this is a cut up 2x4. So it's giant Jenga. You have to watch out when it falls. But just ways of inviting playfulness and inviting that playful spirit that is within all of us, and I think gets lost as we grow up. I mentioned that in the Lutz, we had a community garden. And so for several years, we did liturgical gardening. And I say it's liturgical because we did not necessarily follow our local growing season. So we take some of what we had used for Ash Wednesday and mix it into the soil. And then we would plant our seeds in that soil that had been brought from Ash Wednesday. And up here we have the little containers that everybody takes home to watch their seeds grow and care for them. Most of them come back. Sometimes we have folks who are like, it didn't work. And we always had extra, and it's just sort of this, it's a spiritual practice that starts at home and they bring back when it's time to plant them, usually around Easter.
Liz is locked up for me. If she has for you as well, nod your heads.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I'm thinking she's having connection problems. We'll see if we can get her back. There, Liz, you're back.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
I think there may be something going on with your internet, but we only lost you for about 20 seconds. It was when you were talking about bringing them back at Easter and about time to plant them.
Okay, well, is that better? I'm still feeling choppy. Let's see, maybe I can.
I'd say just go ahead and continue. We hope that it doesn't chop up again, but it looks like you just glitched for another 5 seconds. So we'll see how it goes. I
just switched networks or whatever. So let's see if that makes it better, maybe.
Good.
Yeah, so liturgical gardening, plant the seeds tied to Ash Wednesday and the first Sunday of Lent, and then bring them back somewhere around Easter after we've taken care of them at home, and we have these little sprouts that we then put into the ground, and we put compost in the soil, and we talk about sort of the cycles of life and creation. We talk about how we are all part of the same cosmic stuff, same cosmic dirt, and we talk about ecology and God created the earth, and we just sort of we bring it out into this way that's spiritual and tangible in the dirt. We also, one year, I love this picture, we some birds, I imagine, planted sunflowers for us, and they ended up being like 15 feet tall. And we also got to, so we had our own bed that was kind of messy, very much liturgical, very much not necessarily productive, though we would often have salads or take vegetables home. I'm dropping zucchini off on everybody's doorstep. But the other beds in the garden supported the local food bank. And so we would help support that garden as well with harvesting, because they're growing a huge amount of food. And so we got to do green bean Sunday and package, harvest, wash, package, and then that could be distributed at the food bank later that week. Now that we're in a different space, we don't have the garden anymore. I'm not quite sure what we're going to do about that yet. I won't be doing it for Lent. So we'll see if we can find some other way to bring in that gardening, earth growing element. There have been a lot of different ways that we've brought art, creativity, creating things, building things into our gatherings. Last year, for the first Sunday of Advent, we made Advent wreaths. Most of our community are folks who have not had a church background. If they have had a church background, it's generally from when they were very young, and it's inconsistent on what background it might be. So you might have, folks who are Catholic or Mormon, or just a variety of different backgrounds. And so when I bring Lent, Advent, these sort of church holidays, I have to introduce them as if they're brand new, because they are. So we talk about Advent, we light these candles every week, but nobody at home had their own Advent wreaths. So we got online and found elements that we could put together to make Advent wreaths. And my dad, who's a woodworker, pre-drilled holes so we could just screw things in, and kids drew on them, adults sort of wrote words. We had greens that they could take home. And so we, created this ritual for them to take home. I didn't do it this year because everybody had them. But I really loved it. That same year, we tied it was the second Sunday of Advent with the solstice. And out here, the solstice is a really, it's an important marker in our winter season, because typically the sun sets around 4:30 and it doesn't come up until 8. And so it is very dark. The pictures here of the lanterns, our gathering starts at 4. This was probably 4:45 when we're outside. So, talking about the spirituality of light, and then creating these, their wax paper lanterns. So we used an iron and natural elements and ironed them together, melted the wax a little bit, and then we could tape them and make these luminaries that we set up outside. And it was just it was a very beautiful activity. And then to be able to take them outside, and it wasn't raining that night. And so we just took them and had these moments outside, beginning to welcome and take a deep breath that we were beginning to head towards lighter days. And I think, let's see, I think I have a couple more Advent things. Yeah, our Advent, and that's a nice, I think that's a misspelling there. Advent and Christmas and Lent and Easter, I think, are really easy, accessible opportunities to bring in different ways of being creative because it's a special season. There's a beginning, there's an end. Here's a thing we're bringing for this time period. You don't have to freak out about it because it's not going to be forever. Let's do it. Let's try it out. So one year we were, I don't remember what our theme was, might have been Theopoetics. I don't remember what our theme was that year for Advent, but I took a Christmas tree and hung it upside down, obviously turning Christmas upside down, challenging our Western American narrative around what Christmas is. And each week we added new ornaments as a prayer practice. So we added, I think it was paper chains as a sign of our connection and, holding each other together. There were, I don't remember, there were like wooden shape ornaments that we wrote. Anyway, I don't remember what we did, but we added ornaments each week that sort of fit into the theme of the season. This was also one of the years that we did large art together. So up in the sort of right hand corner, we have, that's the little church space. And we have the Christmas tree, and then we have a table for art. We have someone playing music in the background. We have kiddos playing on the floor. And I think we had just created space to go up and write your prayers, add your ornament, and then we would continue on from there. We also have we have a very fun adaptation, or very fun way of doing Christmas pageant. And so this is just a picture from our pageant this last year. And it's, again, taking the thing that is familiar to maybe a tradition and just bringing a different, like just turning it, just a little bit to get a new perspective on it. We end each year from our very beginning with flying wish paper. And it's this special paper it feels like tissue paper, but you can't just use tissue paper. It's got like a special coating on it. But you can write on it in pencil and then crumple it up, flatten it out, roll it up, and then you can light it. And as it burns down, the heat and the paper float up and burn up, so there's not really anything that comes down. And the idea is this saying a prayer and a blessing for the year ahead, and letting go and saying a blessing and a prayer for for the year behind. Just as this transitional marker, not leaning into resolutions, just noting the shift, and it becomes a shift for our community too, because we've finished Advent, we finished Christmas, and now we're moving into January and sort of the continued dark and wet and less fun months. And so just this mark of like, okay, we're going to turn this corner and we're going to find ways to connect. And so far, nothing has caught on fire. And there hasn't been any catastrophes, but it is something that you want to make sure you do in a space that's safe and with, supervision, lots of people around, kids, all that kind of stuff. So that is my very fast romp through some of the things that Wildwood does as our community to bring in creativity. I'm going to stop sharing here so I can see you all again. We do not do it every week. Sometimes it is just me as a talking head. But for me, it's a creative outlet too. So it's a way for me to feed my own artistic interests and make everybody else go along with them. and just find spaces to welcome in the creative holy and whatever that may lead, wherever that may lead. So I'm going to take a few minutes here to offer space. Do you have questions? Are there things that this idea or spurs for you? Maybe let's start with questions and then we can. Yeah, Tom?
Liz, question for you, please. I am a convinced Anabaptist and came to Anabaptism primarily through the experience of Love Feast and foot washing. So could you speak for a few moments about how you integrate that passage in our faith with art?
See, I skipped over Love Feast because I felt like it was something you all like had already was too familiar for most folks. Again, because you know, probably similar to how you've come into it, Tom, and our folks who are not coming at it from an Anabaptist perspective, it's introducing this kind of weird thing. And the way that we tell the story is very intentional. I do it in a narrative. So we don't do Monday, Thursday, Good Friday, Palm Sunday as distinctive events. I know our folks are not going to come on a Thursday night in the middle of the week. Like, it's just not going to happen. So we do all of that in one Sunday, Palm Sunday. So Jesus' entry, the Last Supper, and the crucifixion, all in one day. And it's a lot. And we end on this really hard place because I don't take us into the hope and possibility that comes with resurrection. So we sit in the hard, but we do, we tie it typically with one of our wild dinners, which is our potluck version. And last year we made communion bread together, which was the first time we got to do that. So I'm teaching them our ritual of making communion bread. Kids love it. It's like shortbread, who's not going to love it? And we have, my dad's congregation closed and bequeathed. I don't know, like in their closing, they gifted us a lot of their elements, financial support, but also, we have the communion set from the congregation. And so we bring out those little shot glasses of grape juice. And I've updated the basins. They're not the yellow ones anymore. But, trying to bring the tactileness of Love Feast told through story in a way that's accessible and familiar, or accessible and has elements of familiarity for folks, even if they're not familiar with the stories. And then bringing in those elements of caring for each other, hospitality, love in action, and really emphasizing that through these actions, through these rituals, we are joining in the collective mission, and as bringing into life the teachings and carrying on the ministry of Jesus. I use different language, but essentially that. So, you can bring in brown paper. I'm going to be judgy here for a moment. There's a UCC church in town who had the great idea of doing foot washing. The pastor told me enthusiastically about it. I was like, oh, honey, we do that already. But she went and got bubble bath and scrubby things. And I was like, okay. And I can give her props of trying to make it accessible. For me, it felt like it was too far a twist on our tradition. But there is some ability to, what's accessible to your folks. We also, we do have spacious options for foot washing, but also options for hand washing. Did I lose you again, or are we good? Okay. That's probably not very helpful, but. Okay, thank you. Any other
Liz, can you say a little more about Wildwood? I'm getting somewhat of a picture of the creativity that you're engrossing in that, but about the practice a little more long term. Is Wildwood engaging now in practice? I'm a little uncertain about that. You say a little more about?
I'm not sure what you mean by engaging now in practice. We meet every week, 4 o'clock on Sunday afternoons. I'm happy to talk more about Wildwood as a community and a church plant. I want to make sure that we have space to dig into questions about creativity. So let's put a pin in that question, Paul, and I'll come back to it. And I'm happy to talk more about this quirky church that I have created.
So let's go over to Modesto.
We unmuted. Hi,
Yep.
I'm Mary. I'm wondering, so whenever you start an activity, let's say you're doing the sidewalk chalk, or you're doing something, outside, or something very non-church in a way, there's not a framework of now we're going to pray, and now we're going to do this, now we're going to do that. How do you work your framework for the Sunday? How do you work that? Do you open with a prayer and say, okay, we're going to move into this, and you kind of maybe do you share a scripture? Do you do like a sermon / Dharma talk? How does like a sidewalk chalk work, or how does a liturgical gardening Sunday work?
It varies. It depends. Not the answer you want. I endeavor every week to bring us together with those words of lighting a candle, and we are connected through the Holy Spirit in and through all things, and in and through all people, to sort of bring us together, and that's our starting point. From there, it depends on the Sunday. Sometimes for Garden Sundays, I'll bring scripture and a sermon, or I'll bring poetry, and I'll sort of start us off, I guess, together, and then introduce the activity. Typically for things like Sidewalk Chalk Sunday, on many Sundays, we have more kids than we have adults, which is awesome. And it presents different challenges. So you're talking about having kids in worship. We actually have had to start taking kids out of worship because it's too chaos. I love their energy, but it's taking up all of the space. And so if we want to have space for more contemplative spiritual practice, we had to begin to bring them out. Now we've brought them back in. Once a month, we do Wild Kids. And so it's a gathering that is kid-centered. And that's been a really fun way to just like all in on storybooks, arts, crafts, and play. And, adults, welcome, please come. This is for the kid in all of us, but we're going to focus on kids' spirituality today. So, Sidewalk Chalk Sundays, there's some weeks where I can't get everybody together, kids are running off. So we just go, and we just recognize that, God is in and through all things, and we live lives that are prayerful lives, and all that we do is prayer. And so sometimes that means I will, if there's someone who, it's a lot of conversation too. So I may bring a piece of reflection in an individual conversation, or, sometimes with the Sidewalk Chalk Sunday, I can almost always bring us back together with popsicles. And so in that moment, while the kids are popsicling, I will sort of offer a prayer or a moment to sort of center down. But there are elements of ritual that I try to hold on to each week, and we're incredibly flexible and adaptive. And I am thankful for it because it gives me a whole lot of flexibility. But it also, there's a lot less structure. And so I have to make it up every week. We don't follow the lectionary. I am creating all of the themes every week, every season. And that's a lot. So there's a little bit of give and take in that too. I have a lot of flexibility, a lot of latitude, a lot of opportunities, and that comes with a lot of work.
Um, you may have answered this a little bit in what you've been sharing about the variety of ways, or each week it seems like it's kind of different, so it may shift. But the question that I've had in my mind is, so whether you're doing a sermon of some sort, or you're working with your hands, or whatever you may be doing, is there any time where people have space to kind of process what's happening for them? Maybe not even in a formal way, and maybe that's happening when people are using their hands. I don't know, but I'm curious about that kind of processing piece.
Yeah, when we're doing things like coloring, painting, even in the garden, we're having conversation. It's not quiet. It's not silent contemplation. So I present this thing, I invite them into the activity, and then sometimes the conversation will run with the topic, and there'll be lots of questions and people sharing from their own experiences. Sometimes we go off in another direction where someone needs to tell or experience something. One of the other pieces that has been a pretty consistent ritual for Wildwood each week is that we have something called check-ins. So we'll share, like we did when we first started, a certain name, pronouns, and then some version of a high and a low from the week. And that also has become the prayers and the time of prayer for prayers and concerns, that people share what's happening in their lives. And so oftentimes we'll integrate, okay, so here's this, like, we're going to do Play-Doh, and I'm going to ask some questions for us to think about, and we're going to do check-ins at the same time. Or here's this activity, and I'll do this thing, and then I'll offer an opportunity to, like, anybody have any questions, or like, how did that feel for you, or what came up for you? And again, that's where it's sort of like, I'll go with the flow. And my notes some week are like, okay, here's our centering, here's our thank you for coming, here's where PayPal is, here's our gathering blessing, and then it's like blank. And I because I'm making it up of like, okay, I don't know how this is going to go. Maybe this activity will totally flop and no one will engage, or maybe we'll run with it. And then I try and have like a bring us together at the end. And sometimes we do it and sometimes we don't. And that's okay. Like, it's okay. Whatever happens, happens.
This is Carolyn Schrock again. All the things you've been talking about describe what we do with our children on our Wednesday night. We do Sunday school Wednesday nights. And I think we're doing a lot of what you're doing, what you're talking about. My question is, how large of a group is this style possible for? I mean, we have 100 to 150 people. How can we do anything like this?
Yeah, it really depends on your style and size and how you can do things. It's exciting that you're doing it with kids. In that context, I might say, can you open it not just to Sunday school for kids, but say, here's our creative worship. There's a whole thing called Messy Church. It has too much structure for me, but it's this idea of like, here's a curriculum around Messy Church, and sort of bringing in that intergenerational piece. And that's what I think is so important about doing creative church, is that I really feel like it has to be intergenerational, because that's where our creative energy can really grow. The kiddos need to build relationship with elders, and elders need kiddos, and everybody in between. We need to be able to share those stories and experiences. And when we understand that we are all reflections of the divine, and we have a greater understanding of God's presence in the world, when we hear it from each other, we need to hear it from all ages of each other. If you have 150 people, it gets really hard to do that. And I think there's, that's where it will take another step of creativity for you to adapt it to your context. You may do something like small groups, have stations. We've done, various versions of prayer stations often. Here's where you can do, make prayer beads. Here's where you can do a, written reflection. Here's where you can write a prayer and tie it to this fabric thing. And so there's these different stations throughout the space that people can move through. And again, you may need to do some in the sanctuary and out in the foyer, and maybe some downstairs. The bigger your group, the more space you can occupy and the more space you can use. Take some more pews out, see what happens, and how you do that. You may also recognize that not everybody's going to want to do it. And so instead of being like, okay, everybody's going to come around a table, here's everybody's going to do it. Here's this opportunity. You can choose to get into it if you'd like, or you can choose to do it where you are.
Liz, quick question on when you're doing things that are mobile, people are moving, things like that, how do you deal with mobility issues of people in the church versus people who, kids who can run here and there and others who are not so mobile?
Yeah. I think it's important to start with making sure that the setup is accessible. Are you trying to put a table with an engagement in a corner by the pew and you can't fit a wheelchair or a walker through that space? Or are you able to set it up in a way that someone could make their way to it? Are there chairs around it? Is it just standing? In the same way that you may adapt for it being on Zoom, can you put a little packet together for someone to stay in their seat? I imagine that when you do communion, you've found ways, and foot washing, you've found ways to adapt it to the community that you have and their needs. And, gluten-free bread, or, hand washing someone who's wheelchair bound, or taking it to someone's home and doing it there. We've already practiced adaptation. This is just another level of having to think it through. And, sometimes just coming up with the idea is a lot. So then to add this layer of how do we make sure it's adaptive can be another step. But I think it's really important, right? We need to be able to make sure that everyone can engage. And if you have a question, I found that just ask them, like, here's this thing I want to do. How can I make it most accessible for you? And allow them to help find ways to allow them to engage in a way that's meaningful.
So Liz, we're coming close to the end of our time. We have about 2 minutes left, and I'm not sure what would be most helpful to make space for you to be able to bring us to a graceful close for our course.
Well, I have a sending blessing, so I'm going to share my screen again. It's going to make us go through all the PowerPoints again. And I'll just say while we're doing that, it's been such a gift to be able to spend this time with you, to get to know some of your contexts and what you're doing. And I hope that I've been able to offer some things that can begin to sort of like percolate in your brain and find ways to settle into it. And I'm happy to sort of be able to continue to answer some questions, support what you're doing in your context. And I'll put in a plug of like, I'm happy to come in and do some, more intentional consultation, or like I said, I brought Wildwood to other congregations in the past and sort of like, here's what we do. Let me come in as an outsider and like model it for you. Can be a little bit of an easy way to enter into it. But yeah, it's just been really great to spend time with you. And I'll send us out with these words. This is Folding Altar by James Cruz. I carry my church with me wherever I go, unfolding the altar of a moment, while out walking with my husband, pausing to pick a few dandelions gone to seed, taking a deep breath, then blowing, sending those silver messengers out into the air above a field, each one the seed of a prayer. I say every day I am alive, please let me give up all hope for a better past and just be here by the side of the driveway, watching wisps of clouds turning pink with evening, then purple, and listening to the complex solo of a catbird perched in a maple as we say goodbye to the light. which may leave the sky tonight, but will stay with us, flickering for years to come. May it be so. I'll give you, this is my information, if it's helpful to find me. You can't make myself smaller. And I can be on for a few minutes to answer any more questions, maybe 10-ish minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz.
Appreciate you sharing this. Take care.
You too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you, friends. This concludes our course. I'll send out the recording soon. If you wish to stay and converse with Liz a little bit more, and Paul will get back to the question for you that we've been. But also, if you need to be on your way, go in peace. Thank you.